All right, thanks for coming along, comrades. First up, how ballsy of Greece? How nuts was that? And I say that because it's sort of in the spirit of Cordelia Fine's talk earlier, and I kind of feel like after seeing that, nothing that I do will ever be adequate philosophy again, so please lower expectations. I'm also not quite sure how long this talk is, so I'm just going to talk for a bit and we'll see what happens. So at the moment I'm writing a book on consciousness, just a sort of standard naturalistic account of consciousness. It may or may not be very interesting, but one of the things that I'm dealing with in the book is this fantastic argument that Liz Irvine's come up with for the claim that there is no such thing as consciousness. At least that's my reading on it. As she would put it, that consciousness is not a scientifically respectable kind. I think that's the same as saying it doesn't exist. She doesn't always say that, but it's a matter of sort of what fight you want to get into, I guess. So, on her view, consciousness is, and we'll talk about the sense of consciousness that she's really interested in a minute, but on her view, consciousness isn't like a single unitary mental kind, it's an arbitrary grouping of different mental functions that we have no reason to put together as a single entity. And on those grounds, it's not investigatable using standard scientific methods, and so we should eliminate it. Now, I'm going to argue that if consciousness is an example of functional emergence, and I'll talk a bit about what that means. If it's an example of functional emergence, then all of her arguments are consistent with it being a unitary, with consciousness being a unitary kind. And so I'm going to suggest that any of her arguments are quite well understood as an argument for consciousness being an example of functional emergence or a functionally emergent kind. Still playing with how exactly I want to go with the terminology. And that any sort of residual arguments about elimination or revision of the concept are really just political debates that don't have deep philosophical implications. So before we really get going, what we want to know is what notion of consciousness Irvine is talking about, because there are, as we all know, heaps of different notions of consciousness in the literature. People mean all sorts of different things. Irvine really focuses on, I'm going to say conscious awareness because I think that's a most general sort of term, but it's cognitive and behavioural access in the block sort of sense. And how we see this is, how we know that this is what she's talking about is by the ways that consciousness is operationalised in all of her arguments. So the kind of consciousness that she's talking about is really summed up by the question, did you see it? So subjects are presented with a stimulus and they're asked in various ways to indicate whether or not they saw it. So there's kind of a cognitive, verbal, behavioural response. So that's why we think it's a sort of access notion of consciousness that she's working with. Doesn't seem to be phenomenal properties, because throughout the book, and I think this is, let's pick a number, the third best book on consciousness ever written, that'll do. Throughout her book, she doesn't talk about any of the ways that we typically try and measure phenomenal qualities. So these are methods like odd one out, just noticeable differences, so on. All the stuff that sort of is analysed through multi-dimensional scaling, she doesn't talk about at all. So I think that we're entitled to conclude that she's not really interested in phenomenal qualities, she's just interested in access or awareness. All right. Now, of course, where this gets confusing in the literature, trying to situate this in the literature, is lots of different theorists have different opinions about what the relationship between access, consciousness or awareness and phenomenal properties is. Some would identify them. So this is one reading of Dennett where phenomenal properties are reduced to access relationships. Others would say, like Liz here would say, that they're just different kinds of phenomena. One's a property of method representing vehicles and another's property of processing. So, it is potentially sort of confusing how exactly what Irvine's position on this is. But, she says this. She says, being conscious of something entails that subjects are able to comment on this state by producing confidence judgments about seeing it, that's an example, or being conscious of something entails having some disposition or attitude towards it. So this, I think, is really compatible with any of the kinds of positions that we see in the literature about the relationship of phenomenal qualities to awareness. I think she really is just leaving them out. Not necessarily one's favourite way to go, but that's what she's doing. Okay, so the book is a wonderful methodological critique of the status of consciousness science as practiced, especially within cognitive neuroscience. Especially looking at people who like to image the difference between a stimulus that's masked to just a little bit so you can still see it, and a stimulus which is masked so much that you can't say you see it. That's the research tradition that she's looking at, and she offers, I think, a lot of really useful critiques of the specifics of those approaches, their specific experimental approaches, and the theoretical implications they try and draw from that. And I just mention this because that's the good part, and now I want to focus on the bit that I don't like. So let's... so the basic structure of her argument, that's what we want to know. The basic structure of her argument is, here's one measure of consciousness in the sense of it will give an answer to the question, did you see it? Here's another one which will answer the same question, and for any two measures like that which we might pick, we can find a circumstance in which they give incompatible or contradictory answers. And that's the basic argument of the entire book, is just looking at different examples of different measures and finding another measure which would seem like a perfectly reasonable way to try and answer the question, did you see it? And showing that it contradicts the first kind. So I'll flesh out this general form of argument with one example. So let's consider a case where a subject is just sitting, looking at a screen, and they're presented with a stimulus in between a couple of masks, and we're wanting to know whether or not they're seeing the stimulus or whether they're just seeing the masks. Now, one way which we might find out is just to ask the subject. So we say, verbally, did you see it? And they can respond with a button press, or verbally saying, yes, I saw that one, no, I didn't see anything then, yes, yes, no, no. And so you get one possible measure. It seems like a reasonable way to answer the question, did you see it? You ask them, and they say yes or no. But this kind of measure is traditionally viewed as a problematic measure of what the subject's conscious of, because it's subject to a whole lot of well-known biases. Now, Irvine's favourite example of this is that we don't like to report swear words unless we're really confident of seeing them. So under identical masking conditions, subjects under identical masking conditions, subjects are much less likely to report the word shit than they are shot. So the masks are exactly the same, the stimulus is presented for the same amount of time, subjects will confidently report that they see shot and will say that they saw nothing if the word is shit. So this is a kind of bias which is problematic for simple verbal report. Now, the traditional way that this has been dealt with in visual cognitive neuroscience has been to use a different measure of discrimination. Rather than verbal report, you force the subject to guess yes or no the stimulus was present, and you develop a measure of whether or not they're better than chance at responding to the stimulus present rather than just the mask present trials. And you do this with a value called D prime, and if you have a D prime which is statistically significantly greater than 0, then it's considered that subjects can discriminate the presence of the stimulus from the just masked trials. Now, the good thing about this measure, because it's a forced choice measure, is it's not subject to the same sets of biases that verbal reports are subject to. And so for, again, Irvine's favourite example with shit and shot, there's identical masking conditions, you'll get the same value of D prime for shit and shot, whereas you're not getting the same verbal report. So this is thought to be a bias-free measure of the subject's capacity to discriminate the presence of the stimulus. So to discriminate stimulus and noise from just noise. All right. Now, of course, what this doesn't mean is that D prime is necessarily a good measure of consciousness. And in fact, it's typically not taken as a good measure of consciousness because, you can get a range of values of D prime which are statistically significantly greater than 0. So subjects have better chance at discriminating, but which, no matter what the stimulus is, the subject can't verbally report its presence. So even for words which don't seem to be subject to sort of politeness biases, you're still getting this gap where subjects are discriminating its presence but not able to report it. Now, the problem with okay, right, so we've got two potential measures of two potential ways of answering the question, did you see it? They're giving different answers. Do we want to say that one of them is better than the other? So do we want to say that, for example, that verbal report's better than D prime? Well, no, because it's subject to these biases. We have good reason to believe that subjects are seeing the word shit even when they're not reporting it. So a verbal report isn't an exhaustive measure of consciousness. But are we then going to favour D prime? Well, a lot of people don't like to because it suggests that you can be conscious of things which you can never report. And a lot of people find that problematic when you're talking about a notion of consciousness as cognitive behavioural access, where report seems to be really important. Yet, if you're just using D prime, then you're going to be saying there are things which subjects are conscious of, but they can't ever report. Some people seem to find that to be a counterintuitive result. So, where does Irvine go from this? Well, and we need to keep in mind that for the purposes of the talk, that this is just one example. She does this for all sorts of different measures. But whenever we're getting something which seems like a good way to answer the question, did the subject see it? Another way seems to be giving us a different answer, and neither method that we pick seems to be entirely problem-free on its own. So Irvine suggests that we just ditch the notion of consciousness from our investigation and just say, well, we don't seem to be tapping into a single thing with these different measures, D prime verbal report. But they're definitely tapping into something. They're tapping into the capacity for discrimination or the capacity to form verbal judgments about visual stimuli. So let's just say that those are robust notions. Capacity for discrimination, we can investigate that in one way with one set of measures. And capacity to verbally report stimulus, well, we can investigate that with another set of measures. So there's a bunch of different cognitive processes, no single core phenomena, that is consciousness. Right, so that's the sort of barest bones of her argument. And, you know, to be fair to her, you want to go and consider the 6 or 7 chapters of her book which are making this argument. Don't have time to fit that in now, obviously. But the implication of this and of cases where there's always, you know, there's always a circumstance where the measures are going to contradict each other. The implication of this is that we can't do a science of consciousness. And we can't do a science of consciousness because our methods from cognitive science now don't work because we can't get our measurements right. So she offers 2 sorts of arguments in this vein. One is that because of the inconsistencies in our measures, we cannot adequately distinguish consciousness from unconscious processing. And the second sort follows the line that there is no convergent measures of consciousness. So let's have a look at the first kind first. So one thing that we do like to do in cognitive science is dissociate phenomena in order to suggest that there are dissociable mechanisms underlying different kinds of thinking. One that's really popular in the study of body experience, which is what I do in my other life as I study body experience. You have two neurological disorders. One is called apraxia, which is a disorder of skilled movement, so an inability to like post a letter through a letterbox or something like this, where that's caused by central nervous system damage, so brain damage rather than muscular or peripheral nervous damage. And you have another disorder with the just awful name of autotopagnosia, which is the inability to localize body parts. So if someone is asked, point to your hand or where's your hand, they can't indicate where it is. But these are 2 distinct disorders and they doubly dissociate. So someone might have apraxia but not autotopagnosia, others have autotopagnosia but not apraxia. And this is used to suggest that there are 2 different systems which refer to the own body, the body schema which guides the body in action control, and the body image which is for making perceptual judgments about the body. So that's a kind of first pass at a dissociation within cognitive science. Now, Irvine's going to say that we can't do that for consciousness, where we want to dissociate conscious processing from unconscious processing. Because the measures that we have don't give us consistent answers as to what falls into the set of unconscious processing and what falls into the set of conscious processing. And you see that again in the D prime verbal report dissociation. If you're looking at verbal report as a answer to the question, did you see it, then you get a much smaller set of things falling into what counts as conscious than if you use D prime, but there's no non-arbitrary grounds for preferring one measure over the other, so you just have an unclear dissociation between conscious processing and unconscious processing. Now, the other problem that that Irvine raises is a sort of general, in science we like to have more than one way to measure something in order to believe it exists. This has been formalised as robustness within the philosophy of science. If we're just looking at the one example I'm giving in the talk, it seems pretty clear enough that there aren't convergent measures. But what Irvine needs to do is show that any apparent convergence that we get between all of the measures when we consider them all together is an artifact of them all converging on one of the sort of processes that she's talking about. So it's all right for her if you get convergence on capacity for discrimination, so long as you don't get convergence across capacity for verbal report and capacity for discrimination. And that's the sort of case that she has to make. Now, that's quite tricky and a longer argument. I want to include it here to be fair to her to say that she did try and make this argument. I'm not going to have time to talk about it today. So what I want to do is just suggest that there are already accounts of conscious awareness where it's fine to have the occasional contradiction between different measures of consciousness. Now, what I'm not saying is that there are going to be cases which are like you're a bit conscious of something or you're weakly conscious of something. I think that's all right. But I'm not so much interested in people going, I'm not sure whether or not I was conscious of it, but these cases where you just get apparent contradictions. All right? So the kinds of approaches where this is okay, I'm going to call functional emergence accounts. And these accounts are any account which says that conscious awareness is a bunch of different access processes to a content or a bunch of different cognitive functions that are organised into a meaningful whole. So rather than, like Irvine is saying, it turns out that the grouping of discrimination and verbal report is arbitrary on a functional emergence account, that grouping is non-arbitrary because when we have all of those processes organised in the right way, subject can do things that they can't do if those processes were completely dissociated or unorganised. Does anyone have such an account? Yes, Dennett does. His idea of the winning draft, the winning representation is the one which is you can verbally report, you can remember, you might be able to form a value judgment about it or so on. And it's all being able to be processed in all of these ways together that makes the winning draft in your multiple draft stream, for people who know Dennett, that makes your winning draft the winning draft, is that it is processed in these ways. Similarly, because Irvine's really focused on the cognitive neuroscience, it's worth saying that any example of a global workspace model is also a functional emergence account in this sense. So I'll just read you this. This is from Dehaene and Natche, who are contemporary global workspace theorists. They say the vast amount of information that we can consciously process suggests that at least 5 main categories of neural systems must participate in the workspace. Perceptual circuits that inform about the present state of the environment, motor circuits that allow for the preparation and controlled execution of actions, long-term memory circuits that can reinstate past workspace states, evaluation circuits that attribute them valence in relation to previous experience, and attentional or top-down circuits that selectively gate the focus of interest. So what we see here is for a mental state, say a visual representation that's part of the perceptual circuit. For that to be in the workspace, where being in the workspace is identified with conscious awareness, just is for it to be processed in a way that allows for skilled and controlled movement, for remembering the stimulus, for evaluating it as, I guess, using Irvine's example, a bit awkward to say out loud in polite company, or something like that. It's just undergoing those processes which constitutes being in the workspace and thus being conscious. But it's all of them together as a meaningful whole. So that's why that's a functional emergence account. Now, these accounts are to be distinguished from like single function accounts of conscious awareness. So Jesse Prince has a single function account where it's conscious in virtue of being the kind of attention that can be directed at objects, which makes it conscious. Rosenthal's higher order thought theory is a single function account. It's conscious in virtue of you having a thought that you are in that mental state that makes it conscious. So the functional emergence accounts, or whatever our best label turns out to be for them, are like Prince and Rosenthal's accounts, but they're multiple functions. All right, so why is it that on a functionally emergent account that it's okay to have contradictions? I want to talk about this with reference to something a bit odd. Max Coulthard, when he was trying to say what cognitive neuropsychology was, decided to do it by an example of how we might investigate a chocolate factory, which seems weird, but because it's kind of a stripped back example, it's also helpful for us to see just what functional emergence is, sort of in principle. So for the chocolate factory, we have a bunch of raw materials which come in, and then we go through different stages of them being processed. How do we do this? We grind them and refine them, and then press them. And then the pressed goods are sent on two different paths. One where we extract something called coca cake from them, which is then pulverized. And from that you get cocoa, like you put on top of your coffee, right? And along the other path, we extract something else, which is called cocoa butter, which is then used in two different ways. First, you add chocolate liqueur, I can't say that, sugar and milk solids, and then that goes through a process called conching, which is basically just spinning it around and making it smooth, and from that you get milk chocolate. Also from the cocoa butter we can go another way and add everything but the milk solids, so not milk solids, but other than that it's all the same. Then that goes through another conching process, and then we get a sugary chocolate. So, what have we drawn? Oh, it's the functional arrangement of the factory. So, we've got three outputs which are potentially produced by a single input. Each box does something to whatever comes in from the previous step, and then sends it on to the next stage. Max likes this because you get roughly the same sequence of boxes and arrows in his theory of reading words and non-words. But the question that sort of makes this example interesting is, what if we're trying to figure out what this factory is doing without asking anyone who knows? Or we could perform like a variety of interferences on the factory, right? So we could do something like not feed it as much raw materials, and then we might find out that we just get cocoa out the end. And if that was the case, then we'd learn something really interesting about the factory, namely that the raw materials aren't randomly distributed through the factory, that they go down one line, and only when that line is satisfied do they go down the other. I mean, that's just an example, but you can learn something about how it functions by doing these sorts of interferences. But what if we were to consider only the cases where we had done some weird interference to the system and not consider any of the normal functioning of it? Well, we might end up thinking that grouping together the production of cocoa, sugary chocolate and milk chocolate together is an arbitrary grouping. They happen to be in the same building, but they're not done in any of the same ways, because by doing the right sorts of interferences, we can get all of the production of one kind to dissociate from production of the other kinds. But that would be an unfortunate conclusion, because we're ignoring the normal functioning. And it means that we would be blind to, for example, that all of them share 3 stages of processing up until a point of divergence, or something like that. Now, what I'm worried about with Irvine is that she's making a similar kind of mistake by focusing on just the cases at the border of things being, or really this ambiguous state of things being conscious or not. She's ignoring cases where things are unambiguously conscious. When is something unambiguously conscious? Well, if we go to the normal sort of stimulus from noise example, which we were talking about before, someone's unambiguously conscious of the stimulus if they can verbally report it, if they can remember it later, if they get a D prime statistically significantly greater than 0. If someone can do all of those things, then there's just no question as to whether or not they're conscious of it in the sense of conscious awareness. They have seen it. But what we're seeing there is the organisation of a lot of different capacities. Capacity for discrimination, capacity for verbal report, being able to feel something about it, being able to remember it later. We're seeing them come together. So, what I'm suggesting is that we need to include these cases in our analysis as well